So, how does the bill take shape? Well, after it is done with all the initial procedures, a bill will be taken in for drafting. It will be drafted by parliamentary councils. These are legal experts whose sole duty is to give legal advice and to draft any legislation that the parliamentarians might need, because these people are professionals. Their sole duty is to do this thing. Usually parliamentarians will resort to this office of the parliament to get this job done. Interdepartmental consultations are held during this process because when a bill is being introduced, it usually it will usually be something that affects more than one department. So it is extremely necessary that if you want the bill to succeed, if you want it to be a very powerful and impactful piece of legislation, that it would be something developed in consultation with the relevant departments. For instance, if you are working on the PACE Act and you're trying to introduce new legislative measures into it, it is always optimal if you consult the police chiefs of the various districts of the United Kingdom. It is always best that you actually ask Scotland Yard about it as well, because they have their own legal experts. They will have their own scientific studies in place where certain legislative measures would be proving inadequate or overpowered. So they would obviously be excellent consultants in this particular matter. Facing the legislature, the bill scrutiny and debate. The first reading and second reading stages, we have already studied those. We don't need to cover those again. The committee stage, the report stage, and the third and final reading, because the British Parliament is a bicameral legislature, meaning it is a lower house and an upper house, the lower house being the popular one, that is the House of Commons, which is elected directly, while the House of Lords is there by appointment or by hereditary peerage. It is the upper house, but in reality, it has very few powers left for it to use. Reconciliation of differences: if amendments are made by one house, then the other house disagree with it. The houses engage in a ping pong negotiation system to reach a consensus, where the bill will actually ping pong between both these houses with observations and objections. Eventually, the parliamentarians will meet in the sidelines and they will work something out. And usually, a very effective piece of legislation would come to the fore. Reaching the finish line, this is basically the royal assent. The royal assent, upon agreement by both houses, bill is sent to the monarch for royal assent, officially becoming an act of parliament. And now, when it does, it becomes an enforceable law. Implementation and beyond. The government now shoulders the responsibility of implementing the act, issuing necessary regulations and guidance, and monitoring its impact, understanding the nuances. Party politics. Government bills backed by the ruling party enjoy advantages in terms of scheduling resources and political support compared to private members' bills. Public scrutiny and media attention. Public consultations and media coverage and parliamentary debates play a crucial role in shaping and refining the government bills. Amendments and compromise. The legislative process often involves negotiations and compromises to address concerns and garner sufficient support for the bill's passage. Therefore, every bit of law that you see coming out of the UK is something that was achieved as a result of bipartisan leadership. They will, both the sides will work with each other. They will try to find a solution to the problem. Therefore, you have a very public facing and very public interested legislation coming out of the parliament, which is always a great thing. From policy to law, some important bills that become acts of parliament are as follows. We have covered these in the previous lecture, लेकिन चलें छोटा सा recap हो जाएगा. Human Rights Act 1998 एक बहुत important bill था. वो basically it was a bill that looked to actually bring certain human rights जो कि conventionally British government apply कर रही थी, उनको legislative cover देना था, because we know that a lot of the British legal system and the law itself is actually based on old treatises, old treaties, old declarations by monarchs, that is the kings and the queens, but they were not legislative instruments, meaning the British Parliament hadn't enshrined those in a book of law that was substantive, that was specifically dealing with that subject matter. So these Conventions did have a force of law because they were in use for hundreds of years, but the British Parliament decided that it was high time that they have to follow the European Union's Convention on Human Rights. They have to follow that tradition and they have to incorporate all of these into specific substantive legal books so that we have proper laws, because one day there might be somebody who's very power hungry and they might become prime minister and they might try to do something dictatorial. Perhaps a king or a queen comes along who wants to use a lot of the conventional powers that they have, which generally monarchs have not used since the late 19th century. But this monarch might decide to do so. So there would be checks and balances of a legislative, substantive nature that would stop them from doing that. Equality Act of 2010 was such a bill, which became an act of parliament later on. Brexit Withdrawal Act of 2018, a very contentious piece of legislation which actually garnered the UK's exit from the European Communities Act of 72, and it created a roadmap of how the United Kingdom would disengage from the European Union for good. NHS Long Term Plan Act 2022, this bill was introduced by Boris Johnson's government. Basically, its aim was to secure sustainable funding for the National Health Service. This is again a very contentious piece of legislation because some people view it as that it defunded the NHS to quite a bit. Basically, Boris Johnson's government was concerned with the ballooning cost of healthcare during COVID-19, so they addressed this particular concern by issuing medical insurance certificates to the public at large, which would be paid for by the government in part, but partly by people's taxpayer money. So people may see their taxes going up and their insurance levels coming down. But as the population of the UK, like everywhere else in the world, is increasing every single day, and as economic challenges mount, Boris Johnson's administration sought this to be a more efficient and saving grace plan so that the NHS isn't completely abolished. Rather, it should stay on and should still be in a better position than in most Western countries. Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act of 2022, again, a very recent piece of legislation. The comprehensive bill introduced by the government overhauled various aspects of the criminal justice system, including changes to police powers, sentencing guidelines, and protest regulations, sparking debates on civil liberties. This was basically introduced to give police some emergency powers in the COVID-19 pandemic days so that they could arrest or at least detain anyone they believed was in violation of the curfews and the restrictions on gathering that were being applied in order to stop the spread of COVID. Class activity, if you wish to do this, case studies dive into specific government bills like the Equality Act 2010 or the Brexit Withdrawal Act of 2018 to understand their journeys and impact. Comparative analysis explore how government bills function in other democracies like the United States and Canada. These would be very good examples because both of these actually derive their spirit of democracy from the British Parliament. Even though when they were colonies of the United Kingdom, they were still subjects of parliament at that time because the parliament was still active, it was quite powerful, and had pretty much curtailed the financial might of the king himself. Future trends consider potential reforms to the legislative process that could enhance the transparency, accountability, and effectiveness of government bills. Please note that this last activity is closely tied to the first one, that is case studies. You may take up a case study of the Brexit Withdrawal Act 2018 and then explore what might the challenges be as the times progress. Public bills deal with matters of national interest and apply to the entire population. They are typically introduced by government ministers to implement government policies or by individual MPs through a process called balloted bills. Public bills address a wide range of issues, including taxation, healthcare, criminal justice, education, environmental protection, etc., etc. They go through a very lengthy and rigorous scrutiny process, which usually involves readings in Houses of Parliament, the committee stage, and the report stage. They require a majority vote in both houses to become law. Public bills benefit from access to government resources and support increasing their chance of success because they are government backed. So basically, we are done with chapter 2. Okay, now we will begin chapter 3, which is delegated legislation. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, basically, what is meant by delegated legislation? Delegated legislation, as the name delegate suggests, is legislation done by people other than the parliamentarians themselves. So, I will give you a brief overview of what is the reason for allowing this. Parliament, the Houses of Commons and the Lords cannot be in every nook and cranny of the country. They cannot be in every village, every city, every town hall of the United Kingdom. It is just not possible, and it would be inefficient and uneconomical for them to be that way. So, therefore, they allow usually through enabling acts, which are acts which allow another authority to make short and extensive laws, or I know this is a contradictory phrase, but by short I mean they have very small jurisdictions. These laws or these rules are usually very specific to a very specific problem. I'll give you an example. For instance, certain customs officers in Pakistan can issue SROs. These are called short regulatory orders regarding a particular border post. For instance, SROs being applied at the Pakistan Iran border in certain places will be different, and the treatment of certain goods at another border gate would be entirely different, even though both borders are between Pakistan and Iran. But on one border, transportation of water and water based goods would be not allowed under the law, would be disallowed under the law, while on the other checkpost, it would be allowed. The reason for doing this are many, because there are nuances and certain regional issues that those officers are better versed with, and it is not possible for the National Assembly, that is and the Senate, that which make up the Pakistani Parliament, to actually be present in on that small border post and actually regulate all the affairs, the tiny matters, and how buildings would be made, of how officers would interact with each other. It is just not possible to do that. And even if a parliament does take the time out to do these things, it would be egregious, it would be very centrist, and it would not be very efficient, because these people, they are not on site, so to speak. So certain authorities are delegated to certain officers of the government and the civil services to do away with as is needed, but their powers are obviously controlled, they are very limited, and they may address the problem only to a certain extent. Usually, all of these things are defined and curtailed by an enabling act of parliament, which defines that you can do this, but you cannot make a rule that might say this. So, let us study this chapter in greater detail now. Delegated legislation sanctioned by Parliament refers to laws formulated by entities or individuals who are outside Parliament's authority. This is your definition for delegated legislation. This authority usually stems from an enabling act, but in the case of the United Kingdom, a lot of the stuff being done by such offices are part of conventions that have been followed since Norman, or even sometimes since Roman times. So they are hundreds or perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 years old. So in certain cases, those would be conventional, but as we know that the British Parliament is working hard and almost completed the process of giving us bodies of law that are substantive and absolutely written down. So, the authority stems from an enabling act, also known as the Parent Act of Parliament. That is an act which actually gives rise to these delegated pieces of legislation, which establishes the legal framework and confers the power to create more detailed laws in specific areas. Very important, you need to remember this. Enabling acts such as the Access to Justice Act 1999 and the Criminal Justice Act of 2003 delegate broad powers to the Lord Chancellor and the Secretary of State, respectively, to modify various legal funding schemes and make delegated legislation in multiple areas. As we can see, the Access to Justice Act and the Criminal Justice Act of 2003 contain a lot of regulations of how legal aid will be dispensed. Legal aid means aid given to a person who perhaps could not afford that legal aid, that legal service by the taxpayers' pounds. So, how those pounds will be spent, how to access that funding, all these rules are left up to the officers actually working to implement these schemes. So, here the Lord Chancellor has the power, and so does the Secretary of State. They can modify, increase, decrease the legal funding schemes. They can make it easier, or perhaps put a few more checks and balances in between. You need two more forms. You need another witness to actually testify that you cannot afford to hire a lawyer, and that your case is a fit case for legal aid, etc., etc. These decisions are left up to these officers because Parliament is only in session for 160 days, and for the rest, they have to take care of their own business. They have to talk to their constituents. They have to be in their constituencies. So they have very limited time for public business. So therefore, these nitty gritties, these tiny micromanagement tasks are left up to these two officers to take care of. But yes, Parliament will actually decree how much money in this particular budget year or fiscal year will be put up for allowing legal aid to the public. They will have to work within that budget. Secondly, need for delegated legislation. Why is it so important to have this particular measure in place? Firstly, complexity of regulations often surpasses Parliament's capacity for in depth consideration and debate or every intricate detail. It is just not possible nor feasible for Parliament to actually jump down into that rabbit hole, into that particular county or specific tiny field of law, to actually go and micromanage these things. So, because there are time constraints, and it is better to do a job properly than to just, wing a job. They shouldn't be winging these things. So, they leave it up to the people who are in direct contact with these issues and who are dealing with these issues in a professional way. Technical expertise. Parliamentarians, in many cases, won't be barristers, solicitors, or legal fellows. Some might not even have a college education. Some might just be high schoolers or high school graduates who have been elected by the people in their constituency and sent to represent them in Parliament. So, therefore, sometimes the problem at hand would be an engineering issue, would be a standards maintenance issue, which again is an engineering thing, so, or a legal standards thing, which would be a lawyer's subject. So it would always be better to allow the experts of that field, who are the civil officers, the civil servants, and the Lord Chancellor, who have access to those specialized civil servants, to actually make the tiny daily basis governing rules that are needed for working in that field. So therefore, they would leave those up to those people. So what this does is it's a very effective way of allowing technical expertise to reach across the aisle and to apply what needs to be done in a proper way in this particular situation in order to fix it. Consultation benefits. Ministers can engage in further consultation before drafting regulations, particularly crucial for technical matters, because as you delve into complex subjects like automotive regulation policies, for instance, Pakistan also has an automotive policy. We issue one for the next 5 or 10 years. So, whenever that automotive policy comes in, it defines what are the minimum safety standards and emission standards for cars. Same is the case with the United Kingdom. In fact, it is way better than ours. They give out an automotive policy every 2 or 3 years. Now, how that automotive policy will be applied to the manufacturers is usually left up to the bureaucrats, the civil servants under the Lord Chancellor, who are specifically well versed with automotive engineering. Those people will actually read European Union standards, American standards, Japanese standards, and they will issue their own set of standards. Pardon me. So basically, what happens is you have those people who know what the science behind these things is, and they will actually produce the right set of rules and actually make relevant and realistic regulations that the manufacturers can follow. And they will have direct contact with the vendors. There would be a back and forth. So there wouldn't be any situation where a vendor just says, this is too much, we are going to leave the country. So it is always effective that we do this in a very proper and good way. Expedited response. In emergencies or under urgent situations, the lengthy process of passing an act of parliament may hinder timely lawmaking. Delegated legislation provides a quicker alternative of parliament and allows for easy amendments or revocations to address evolving circumstances. For instance, there would be things regarding certain construction practices that have been proven to be dangerous, but which were not illegal in the previous rules. So, Parliament would, instead of just interfering in the construction industry or the construction sector's business, would create an enabling act, which is usually already existing. And because of that, the civil engineering departments of governments or county governments would add extra layers of protection to the public so that the architects and the construction companies need to go through an additional layer of scrutiny and double checking and rechecking so that the best construction bylaws are in place. And these bylaws, again, it is always better that they are formulated not by people in parliament, but rather by the people on the ground who are enforcing that law typically. What are the types of delegated legislation? Let's see. Orders in council, these enable the government via the Queen and Privy Council to create legislation without Parliament's involvement, often used to give legal effect to European directives. But this is not the case always. The United Kingdom has had a very vibrant delegated legislative culture about it, especially regarding customs and tax policies at the border level, for immigration policies at again the border level, and again for disaster relief management at the disaster site level. What they would do is, instead of telling firefighters how they're supposed to do their job, they will create guiding laws, and the local mayor would perhaps increase the funding of the fire department and task them or mandate them to maintain at least 5 or 10 fire engines and to maintain a minimum strength of firefighters no matter what. And for that, they may actually increase or decrease locally available funding. So these kind of leeways and these kind of powers are left up to the mayors and to the junior officers, and usually this is exercised through the Queen's Privy Council. As we know, it is King Charles these days, so basically it is left to King Charles. I believe he's King Charles the second or the third. So, and His Majesty's Privy Council is responsible for empowering officials to do this job. Additionally, they are invoked in emergency situations under the Emergency Powers Act of 1920 and the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004. Statutory instruments. Government ministers and departments wield authority to establish regulations within their specific domains, leading to approximately 2,000 statutory instruments annually. That is a lot of work being done. Acts like the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005 and Serious Organized Crime Police Act 2005 grant ministers powers to create delegated legislation. What this does is, basically, if a particular area of the country or a city or a county is plagued by gang violence, for instance, in their countries in the West, there is the concept of colored gangs, meaning they would wear their own colors. In the USA, you see a lot of them. You see MS-13. It is a very popular street gang, and it is basically populated by Latino Americans, mostly coming in from El Salvador and Honduras, and some Mexicans as well. And then you would have a very old African American gang, which split into two, and both factions are constantly and perpetually at war. It would be the Bloods and the Crips. The Bloods wear red, and the Crips will wear blue. So it is considered something that should be dealt at the police department or perhaps at the mayoral level or perhaps at the attorney general's offices level rather than for the Senate or for the House of Representatives of the USA micromanaging how a particular district in Los Angeles would be run. It would always be better just to allow the governors of the states to make certain types of laws so that they are able to get the job done effectively. So therefore, Same is the case with the United Kingdom. Bylaws, local authorities, corporations, and certain companies can formulate bylaws governing their jurisdiction, from countrywide laws by councils to specific rules by corporations, like smoking bans on the London Underground. These were issued by city authorities who stated, or particular authority that dealt with urban transportation. So they would just make a bylaw and say you cannot smoke in areas that are not marked as smokers corners. So if you need to smoke, you need to go in a smokers area which is designated by black signage. It say smokers area, smokers area. It has exhausts and fans. You can go stand under that and you can smoke whenever you need to. So that is a very good example of delegated legislation in effect. So, how do we control delegated legislation? Because after all, the United Kingdom's Parliament is the supreme body of control, rule, and law in the UK. Parliament and courts exercise control over delegated legislation. It is not something that these civil servants or these functionaries can perform, or the ministers can perform very freely. It does have oversight. Parliament's oversight, albeit limited, commences with the Enabling Act's parameters, meaning the act that Parliament initially passed controls what kind of delegated legislation can be made and what would not be allowed. So those enabling acts are usually very clear, and extremely drastic changes are usually not possible. And therefore, they are usually not allowed. The Legislative and Regulatory Reform Act of 2006 also outlines procedures for statutory instruments aiming to repeal existing laws. Courts possess the authority to challenge delegated legislation where judicial review. So obviously, when a citizen can challenge a piece of delegated legislation, they can take it to the courts, and yes, the courts have the power of judicial review. They can in fact take these cases up and actually define what the authorities can do and cannot do under the Enabling Act. Civil claims or appeals ensuring compliance with the Enabling Act. Several case laws such as R versus Home Secretary ex parte Fire Brigades Union 1995 and Strickland versus Hayes Borough Council 1896 have exemplified the court's scrutiny over delegated legislation. Please ensure that you do read R versus Home Secretary and Strickland versus Hayes Borough Council, because these are very important cases. And in fact, these are the ruling cases for this chapter. Circumstances, criticisms of delegated legislation, democratic concerns. Firstly, delegated legislation deviates from the elected House of Commons, allowing non elected entities to formulate laws. This raises the concerns about limited parliamentary control, subdelegation of issues, the delegation of lawmaking authority to civil servants, seemingly validated by a higher authority, prompts concerns of rubber stamping rather than genuine scrutiny. Volume and clarity, the abundance of delegated legislation complicates understanding and tracking current laws, further exacerbated by their private formulation compared to public discourse in Parliament. Obscure wording similar to Acts of Parliament, delegated legislation suffers from complex and convoluted language. And congratulations, we have finished chapter 3, delegated legislation. But please do read the textbook chapter once at least, and do read Fire Brigade's case and the Strickland versus Hayes case very thoroughly, because these are the most important case laws from this chapter and can be subjects of your exam.